faith, redemption, and the complex threads of God's divine plan come together in the Christian tapestry to make sense of suffering. Now, here's how this point of view plays out, providing guidance and comfort to those who seek into these passages of Scripture. So as we go through it, as Christians, we understand how the fall filtered all of human history through the lens of suffering. Sin's destructive force ruined the initial harmonious creation, bringing about it pain because of the disobedience. Our shared humanity was a canvas upon which the brokenness of the world splashed painful and trying brushstrokes. The Bible doesn't stay silent when it comes to the fact that everyone suffers. It acknowledges the fact that the divine and human Jesus experienced pain in this world. This biblical perspective is an open invitation to all people, serving as a general reminder that difficulties are intrinsic to life. Recognizing this common ground helps us bond over our common humanity, a bonds that outlast any given moment or circumstance. So the central tenet of our faith is that the belief that God is ultimately in control of everything, including evil. From this vantage point, it's clear that we can't fully fathom God's grand scheme. His work is complex and profound, and it has meaning and extends far beyond our own comprehension. So in Christian worldview, adversity isn't just a random splash of paint, but rather a tool to develop resilience, strengthening faith, and expanding spiritual horizons. Now, in the passage in Romans chapter 5, verse 3 to 5, explains how adversity gives rise to fortitude, molds one's character, and gives new life to one's hope. Now, one of the most beautiful truths of all of Christian doctrine is the suffering can be redeemed. We identify with Christ's crucifixion agony, see parallels between his suffering and our own. So this is where we discover significance. We can share in the sacred tapestry of Christ's suffering and his ultimate redemption by allowing our own tribulations to become part of a redemptive narrative, just as his suffering gave birth to salvation. You see, the Christian outlook on suffering is founded on the unfaltering hope of an everlasting promise. And the dawn of eternity is glimpsed in the darkness of earthly suffering. Having this knowledge motivates us, as it serves as a constant reminder that the difficulties that we are encountering right now are merely temporal. When we are with God, our tears and our sorrows will dry up, and we will be left with a beautiful tapestry of everlasting joy and peace. You see, this Christian view of suffering is like a tapestry. It is full of colorful threads that invite us to explore faith, redemption, and God's plan. It weaves the sacred story of God's plan into the fabric of our lives, giving us perspective, solace, as we face the inevitable difficulties ahead. So we're looking now at the paradox. Throughout the ages, people have been fascinated by the seeming incongruous coexistence of good and the powerful deity and evil and suffering. You see, philosophy, theology, and the quest for truth have all been dominated by this mystery, this paradox at the crossroads of faith and reason. To fully understand God's nature and the complexities that define our existence, we must delve into the depths of this paradox, this conundrum that beckons us to look beyond the surface. The existence of evil and suffering seems to cast a shadow on these divine attributes. And when we consider the coexistence of a God who is both infinitely powerful and infinitely good, we wonder why is good God will allow such pain and suffering in a world? How can an all-knowing God allow innocent and righteous people to suffer needlessly? Now, still, as we continue down the path of reflection, we can come to an important realization. It is in the midst of this paradox that we have a chance to hone our grasp on the nature of God and the meaning of life itself. So, a good God gave us brains so we could think and reason and to figure out the answers to big questions. But putting our minds at work to figure out what's going on here, we're going to need skills that can make us unique in a grand scheme of things. So also the contradiction makes us think about the complex web of free will, which is a blessing that gives us the ability to make our own decisions. Now, you look at the presence of evil and suffering as the natural result of free will. The value of virtue and goodness would be diminished in the world without the freedom to make ethical decisions. See, the moral development that results from facing repercussions of our actions is the integral part of the journey we call life. Compassion, courage, and perseverance are defined as the fires of adversity. It's in addition to calling into question the existence of God's will, a good God. Evil, very existence, invites us to join in the construction of a universe in which good ultimately triumphs over evil. Now, humanity has a divine spark of reflex, which the Creator's goodness and stories of those who show remarkable acts of love and selflessness in the face of adversity are evidence of this. Now, simply put, the existence of evil and suffering does not prove non-existence of a good and powerful deity, but rather that there are many more depths to the earth and more layers to acknowledge, to be discovered. It encourages us to humble, to recognize our ignorance, and to set our path on the incessant exploration, on the path that we may come to realize that the apparent contradiction is not impediment of our faith, but rather an opening of profound union with the divine, union that goes beyond the limited understanding and ushers us into the boundless realm of an awe and wonderful God. So, insight into the contradiction, the paradox. Well, the mysterious problem of evil is at the heart of philosophical and theological debates, based on a line of reasoning that makes us question the very nature of God and the existence of suffering. Well, this intellectual conundrum can be seen as an argument against God's existence. Well, to paraphrase a syllogism, the essence of the evil problem is as follows. 1. If there were such a thing as perfectly powerful being, it could stop all evil from ever happening. Well, 2. In as much as it is possible, a good being will try to stop evil from happening. 3. In the Bible, God is described as both all-powerful and all-good. 4. Evil shouldn't exist if there's a perfectly powerful and good God. 5. Yet there is no denying the existence of evil in the world. And 6. As a result, people doubt and even deny the existence of a God who is both all-powerful and good. So let's look now into the understanding of evil, a concept analysis. Well, the term evil is used here in its broader sense, including both moral evil, humanly perpetrated acts of violence like murder, theft, and rape, and the natural evils, acts of violence which are caused by natural phenomena like earthquakes, tornadoes, diseases, outbreaks. Well, suffering caused by natural disasters is also included in the problem, not just the suffering caused by humans or to humans. So, looking at a beautiful contradiction here, there is an inherent tension between the attributes of God or to God and the reality of suffering, which is revealed by the logic of this argument. The core of the problem is the belief that an all-powerful and all-good God would eliminate or at the least completely prevent all forms of evil if only he chose to do so. So now we're looking into the theological conundrum exposed. Well, such a puzzling situation forces us to engage in a serious theological reflection. It compels us to consider the significant issues concerning the nature of God's involvement in the world and in human life. Now, we have a hard time to reconciling the idea of a God who is both all-powerful and all-loving because of the existence of suffering, whether it be caused by humans or by nature. So in search of answers and the deeper meaning, trying to solve the problem of evil is more than just a mental exercise due to its complexity. Our hearts are broken. Our thirst for vengeance is quenched, and our search for God's purpose in our lives is intensified as we confront these universal human experiences. So exploring the limits of our faith and the philosophical inquiries, the problem of evil invites us to learn more about the complex relationships between the divine characteristics of human agency and the nature of reality. So what I would like you to do now is to divide yourselves into pairs, into small groups, assign paragraphs or sections of the text, the paradox, to each group. For example, group 1 is paragraph 1 and 2, group 2 paragraphs 3 and 4, group 3 paragraph 5 and 6, group 4 7 and 8, group 5 9 to 10, group 6 11 to 12. So in your groups, these participants should discuss the ideas presented in their assigned sections and reflect on the paradox of evil and suffering. So share your understandings of the context and the concepts presented. That's one. Express any personal thoughts or feelings that text invokes. Explore how the presented ideas resonate with your own experiences and beliefs. Consider any questions or insights that may arise from these discussions. Now, after the group have discussed, gather the participants back together as a larger group as we came together, and then invite each group to share insights from each discussion. Now, one must encourage open dialogue and be respectful in sharing of perspectives. Now, the facilitator must guide the discussions by drawing connections between the different sections and encouraging participants to build upon each other's thoughts. You see, this activity promotes in-depth reading of the selected passages from the paradox, which in turn promotes introspection, free-flowing discussion, and an investigation of the various facets of the problem of evil, the paradox that we face. It encourages a sense of community and shared inquiry amongst members, allowing for a deeper look into the text. So as we go away from this, there must be not a feeling of understanding the subject, but rather a pursuit to understanding who God is. So looking at Theodicy. Well, what is Theodicy? Theodicy is a philosophical and theological concept that seeks to explain how evil, suffering, and injustice can coexist with faith in an all-knowing, all-powerful deity. Well, the Greek roots of the English word theodicy are theos, meaning God, and dike, meaning justice or judgment. The central question that theodicy attempts to answer is why good and loving God would allow evil and suffering to coexist. See, theodicy is like theories or frameworks that aim to explain how evil can coexist with the characteristics of a good God. So throughout history, many theodicies have been proposed, each offering a unique take on how to make sense of this tricky problem. So there are various theodicies, each with its own strategy for dealing with the problem of evil. The following are examples of common theodicies and not exhaustive to these, but there are many others that you could do in your own study. Well, the free will theodicy states that God gave people an ability to choose right from wrong. Human free will can be used for good and evil. This view maintains the idea that free will is important and calls for genuine love and virtue. Well, there's the other, suffering and adversity, according to soul-making theodicy, helps shape and perfect a person's moral fiber. Personal development, empathy, and a more nuanced grasp of the moral principles are all possible outcomes for overcoming adversity. The belief that God permits evil because it contributes to some higher good is known as a greater good theodicy. The idea here is that improving one's morality or spirituality requires going through some kind of trial or hardship. Well, what about the best of all possible worlds theodicy? Well, this theodicy contends that given the constraints and the trades-off inherited in all creation and the world in which we find ourselves is the best possible one. To achieve cosmic harmony and balance, evil and suffering are essential. According to the process theology, God is not all-powerful and the world is always changing. And as a result of this constraint of creation, evil, existence, God is constantly influencing and interacting with the world. The mystical theodicy is that it's recognizing that it may be impossible for humans to fathom the causes of evil. According to the proponents of this mystical theodicy, conventional methods to inquiry into the nature of God will lead nowhere. So, as varied as the human thought and interpretations in the face of philosophy and theological challenges, theodicies are attempts to address the fundamental questions that are raised about the existence of evil. So let's do one activity here. Well, the activity explores theodicies through role-playing objective. Well, this activity aims to help participants understand and engage in the different types of theodicies by embodying and presenting various perspectives in the role-playing scenario. So instructions. Now this is which is going to be, you need to send or pass this information, which will take about 15 minutes, explaining how it's going to work in this role playing. Well, begin by explaining the concept of theodicy and the different types of theodicies: free will, soul making, greater good, best of all possible worlds, process theology, mystical. So then you're going to briefly describe each theodicy, highlight its key principles and approaches to addressing the problem of evil. Well, the role assignment, which is 10 minutes, is to divide the participants into small groups, with each group focusing on one specific theodicy type. Assign the role to each participant within the group, and a philosopher, a theologian advocating for the theodicy, and a skeptic who challenges or questions that theodicy. Preparation, give about 15 minutes. Now, in their groups, participants should discuss and develop arguments for their assigned theodicy. The philosopher should focus on presenting and persuading points to support the theodicies, explaining for the problem of evil, while the skeptic, on the other hand, should prepare thoughtful questions that counter the arguments, challenges the theodicies, and shakes up that validity of those arguments. Well, the role play should take about 20 minutes. In each group takes turns presenting their theodicy and role play to the larger group. The philosopher explains the theodicy's key concepts, rationale, and how it addresses the problem of evil. Well, the skeptic challenges the theodicy with the questions and counter arguments, encouraging critical thinking and debate, provoking for further discussion. Well, discussion is the last part, which we come into about 15 minutes. After each group role plays, open the floor for a brief discussion. Each participant will be able to ask questions, provide feedback, and encourage and engage in respective dialogue. So facilitate a broader conversation about the strengths, weaknesses, and implications of each theodicy. Well, you could go into reflection, which is about 10 minutes, conclude the activities with a reflection session, asking participants to share their thoughts on the different theodicies, the challenges proposed by the problem of evil, and any insights gained from the role-playing experience. So, what do we really want to take away from this discussion or this activity at the end? Well, through the role-playing and in-depth discourse, this exercise invites participants to consider the theodicies. Participants gain a better understanding of the complexities and nuances within the theodicy frameworks by taking on the roles of that advocate and provoke skeptics that would be encouraged through thoughtful, compassionate, and civil discussion of philosophical and theological ideas. This is not to cause a sort of a heated arguments and debates and such as that, but merely an engagement of the knowledge and being able to grapple and grasp it. Let's now look into the intellectual and the experiential realm. Well, in the philosophical discussion of evil is often discussed within an abstract with like terms like evil in general. Well, in this quest, philosophers, theologians, and thinkers investigate the origin of evil and how they coexist with a good and powerful God. Well, this line of thought involves investigations, various theodicies, exploring the nuances of free will and the attempt to reconcile the existence of evil with the existence of a good God. Well, there it is a clear realization that emerges amidst the theoretical discussions. Conceptualizing evil may provide insights, but it cannot alleviate the problem of an individual's suffering. So when we move from discussing evil in a general to discussing it in a specific instance of evil, the chasm between the theoretical investigation and the personal experience becomes altogether very clear. Now here the fight against evil must move from an intellectual to an experiential. When this happens, suffering, pain, and the cruelty are no longer an abstract ideas, but they are present, painful realities. The pain of a loved one, the devastation of a natural disaster, and the witnessing of cruelty and the struggle with personal pain are not hypothetical examples of evil anymore. Well, C.S. Lewis, a highly intelligent individual who wrote about his own internal struggles with evil in the problem of pain, he reasoned it out, trying to square the philosophical problem of evil with the religious convictions. And when tragedy struck in his own life, however, he had to watch his wife Joy suffer and die from an illness. He found that his theoretical understanding was inadequate. His philosophical arguments paled in the face of such palpable suffering, and he found himself overcome by waves of emotion. So Lewis' story highlights an essential truth. There is a great chasm between the knowing about evil in theory and actual experiencing it. So in the face of real pain, the theoretical framework that seemed adequate in theory pale in comparison. So in face with the raw emotions of sorrow, grief, and anguish, the philosophical discussions that once held sway fade into the background. The gap between the theoretical and the personal problems of evil become a point of realization on this journey. It forces us to see that while philosophy and theology provide valuable insights, they need to be supplemented by a more holistic strategy, one that takes into account the significance of the impersonal bound feelings of empathy and common suffering. So to grasp the evil, we must in essence travel between the worlds of theory and emotion, of thought and experience. It encourages us to recognize the worth of having friends who will stand by us through thick and thin, both in times of happiness and sorrow. This nuanced difference highlights the multifaceted nature of human experience as a journey requiring both intellectual comprehension and compassionate engagement. So when confronted with the ugliness of suffering of the world, we are able to have some hold on hope and faith and love. So now looking into the general versus specific instances of evil. Well, the philosophical study of evil, including its nature, origin, and compatibility with the existence of a good and all-powerful God, is what is meant by evil in general. Examining the problem of evil conceptually, philosophers, theologians, and apologists seek to provide reasonable answers for why evil persists despite the existence of a good and all-powerful God through the development of theodicies. Now, when we talk about specific instances of evil, we are referring to the actual, tangible examples of suffering, pain, and wrongdoing. Now, that people which will have to face on a daily basis that we tend to forget. These instances are deeply meaningful because they are individual and reflective. Instances of evil are grounded in the real world with real people, real things, and real outcomes. Well, natural disasters, personal losses, accidents, and cruel acts are all examples. Now, in the face of evil, people often seek to make sense of the world around them, to find solace and meaning in the midst of suffering. Now, it is important to distinguish between evil in the general and the specific evil instances, because there is a vast gulf between philosophical inquiry and the emotional realization or the real world impact of the encountering of evil. So specific acts of evil bring abstract questions and theoretical debates about evil down to earth, where they intersect with the real people's lives, feelings and emotions and experiences. It faces the actual pain, grief and struggles that individuals undergo in response to concrete instances of suffering, and the nature and the problem of evil becomes more complex. So this distinction highlights the difficulty of being together philosophically, understanding and individual experience. While philosophical discussions can shed light on the origins of evil in the world as a whole, they may not be able to answer specific questions about feelings that arise in response to individual tragedies. So as they come to terms with personal pain, tragedy, those who have been afflicted by acts of evil may look for more than just an intellectual answers. The nuance emphasizes the need for multifaceted strategy that includes both theoretical investigation and sympathetic consideration of the experiences of people who are directly confronted by evil. So we have to be compassionate as much as having a substance to fulfill the need of that pain one is suffering with, in bringing in hope and joy and peace. So we're now going into activity time again. Well, this activity will be bridging the gap between theory and reality objective. Well, the activity aims to help participants explore the distinction between evil in the general and specific instance of evil, highlighting the challenges and the insights that arise from bridging the gap between an abstract philosophical inquiry and a personal encounter with suffering. So for instructions, we'll spend 10 minutes. We'll begin briefly by explaining the concepts of evil in a general and specific instance of evil as described in the text. Now know that you can go and Google this up and find it. Just be careful what you read. Don't get yourself into the wrong website. So the emphasis here is the distinction between the theoretical exploration and the personal experience of suffering. So group discussion, 15 minutes, divide the participants in small groups again, assign 1 or 2 specific instances of evil to each group. These could be scenarios of personal suffering, tragedies or ethical dilemmas, or ask each group to discuss how the specific instance of evil differ from the abstract philosophical discussions about evil in general. So you could make it a more philosophical discussion. Well, encourage them to consider emotional, ethical and practical dimensions rather than more philosophical third-party approach. Then the personal reflection, which is about 10 minutes, have the participants take a few minutes to individually reflect on the time that they're spent in their lives when they're encountered a specific instance of evil or suffering. It could be personal experience or something that they witnessed. Then call this the sharing circle, which is 20 minutes. Create a sharing circle where participants take turns in sharing their reflections or their specific instances of evil they encountered. So encourage participants to share not only the details of the experience, but also the emotional responses to the questions and the insights, delving deeper. So then we're going to go into the group reflection. 15 minutes we're going to spend in this. Lead a group discussion about the challenges and the insights that arise when trying to bridge the gap between the theory and the personal experience. Discuss how encountering specific instances of evil can impact one's understanding of abstract philosophical discussions. Now, explore the role of emotions, empathy, and the need for suffering in the face of personal suffering. Now, synthesize and takeaway. This is 10 minutes. You will summarize the key takeaways from the discussions, emphasize the importance of the holistic approach that acknowledges both intellectual exploration and compassionate engagement with personal stories. Now, what you want to take away with this entire activity is that the activity aids participants in understanding the differences between the theoretical study of evil and its practical application in the real world situations. So participants gain a deeper understanding of the complexities of this problem through the sharing of personal experiences and the discussing of emotional dimensions of encountering evil. So the exercises that you will be doing, it encourages an introspection, a sympathy and an understanding of relationships between rational thought and heartfelt interactions. Do not lose an opportunity where some are still hurting that you could pray for, some are still grieving that you could bring comfort to. And it's a good time of getting to know each other on a more personal basis. So do take the time and enjoy that. So seeking comfort and meaning through suffering. Well, the problem of evil is a philosophical question of incalculable depths arising from and at the very center of life's most trying experiences. So instead, it becomes a guiding light that brings comfort and points the way to a more meaningful life for those who are struggling in the shadows of tragedy. So by looking into the origins of evil, we validate the full range of human emotions and experience. Theodicy accepts suffering as a shared human experience rather than denying it. So knowing that you are not alone in the struggles, and that dealing with the pain is a universal human experience that can be a great source of solace. So when we think about why bad things happen to good people, we develop empathy and compassion. And when going through tough times, and the bond of empathy can be relied on or supported in the midst of despair, knowing that others can overcome adversity with fortitude and dignity can light the way. So investigating the origins of evil force us to ask the old age question, why is there suffering in the world? By asking this question, we must first take some steps back on the path understanding by looking inward, engaging in a philosophical contemplation. We may come to understand that suffering, when we met with bravery and faith, can be a source of these positive outcomes. Well, the Christian story of Christ's suffering and our ultimate redemption it sheds a new light by the apologetic Christian lens. So God's solidarity with human suffering is the best illustrated by incarnation and the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. This story not only demonstrates how to bear adversity with grace, but it is also guarantees that growth and renewal are possible in the wake of tragedy. So the study of Theodicy necessitates an intensive investigation into the divine. And this method has the potential to deepen one's comprehension of God's attributes like power, knowledge, and love. The realization that there is a divine plan beyond human comprehension can be a source of comfort and strength for those believers in the face of adversity. So weaved in with the threads of joy, triumph, and fortitude is the threads of suffering. The study of evil provides a roadmap for making one's way through the complex architecture, leading one to peace and significance. It's a reminder that hardship can be transformed into a chance for greater self-awareness, empathy, and spiritual development. So apologetics not only accepts the reality of pain, but it also gives us a model for welcoming it in serenity and gratitude. Faith and reason harmonizes in the pursuit of knowledge, illuminating a way out of the hopelessness, out of the obscurity, and into a beauty that is all the more radiant for having been forged in the fires of adversity. So activity exploration time again, and this time we are comfort and meaning through suffering is the objective. So this activity aims to help participants engage with the idea of seeking comfort and meaning through suffering using personal reflection and group discussion to explore the role of theodicy in navigating life's challenges. So what you need here is some materials which will be required is a paper and pen. 20 minutes introduction, begin by reading aloud or summarizing the text that discusses seeking comfort and meaning through exploration of the problem of evil. Explain that the activities will focus on a personal reflection and group discussion to look deeper into the concept. So then we're going to go into personal reflection, about 15 minutes here. Provide participants with paper and pens. Ask participants to take a few minutes to sort of individually reflect on a personal experience of suffering and hardship they have faced in their lives. Encourage them to consider how to understand suffering and theodicy influence their response in their experience. Basically, also asking us how did they get comforted in the time. The small groups in sharing in 20 minutes, divide the participants in small groups, 4 to 6 people. In these groups, ask participants to take turns sharing of personal reflection on the experience of suffering and how the exploration of theodicy provided comfort or meaning. Now you need to encourage the participants to listen actively and offer support and empathy to each other. Then we go into the group discussion. 15 minutes of this, bring the group back together, and as a larger group, open the floor for a group discussion on the following questions. How did the exploration of the problem of evil influence your perception of the suffering in your personal experience? Remember, before we actually looked at the problem of the suffering in their lives, but not looked at it from the light of theodicy. Well, in this ways, the concepts of theodicy provide comfort. And in what sense do they provide it in the meanings of these times of hardship? So how did they understand of Christ's suffering or the divine attributes' impact on our perspective on suffering? Then shared insights, about 15 minutes. Invite a few participants to share their insights, key takeaways from the small groups discussions and the group discussion together, sharing. So the collective reflection, which should take about 10 minutes, facilitate a reflection on the overall experience of the discussion, comfort and the meaning through the exploration of theodicy. Encourage participants to consider how this concept might influence their approach to future challenges and hardships. So, the key takeaway points here. Participants in this activity will give them a chance to deeply think about their own suffering, their own experiences, and to search their theodicies as to how it's helped them in the meaning. And by discussing and listening to one another's experiences, we can learn to empathize with one another's pain, find comfort in one another's strength. And after completing the exercise, participants should have a fresh appreciation, not just for the theodicies and how it offer comfort, but also in the ability of sharing and bearing with one another's burdens. So, enjoy. So the problem of evil. Many people who have doubts about God's existence points to the problem of evil. As a reason to do so, this skepticism stems from the apparent contradiction between God's goodness and the existence of evil in a world of suffering. Now, many people think God doesn't exist because He wouldn't allow suffering to happen if He did. Well, dealing with the paradox, this conundrum, the central difficulty stems from the apparent contradiction between God's omnipotence and the existence of evil. So why does suffering continue if God has the ability to stop it and is driven by goodness? Well, this discrepancy calls into question the very nature of God's and necessitates serious philosophical and theological inquiry. Well, the responses from Christians. Well, Christians have been giving their responses for over 2,000 years. And they center around two ideas: the theodicy and the inscrutability. Theoretically, God's permissiveness of evil can be explained by the principles inherent to His nature and his plan for the world. Well, this method presents a variety of theodicies, each of which provides a unique explanation for the existence and the purpose of God, of suffering, whether it be for alignment of greater good, formation of character, or manifestations of divine justice and mercy. Another option is the path of inscrutability. Well, this recognizes that God's intentions are too complex for human understanding, and it argues that we can't fathom God's providence in its entirety because of our human limitations. And just because we can't understand why God allows evil doesn't mean he doesn't have sort of good reasons for doing so. We're next going to look into the biblical perspective of this. So, looking to the biblical perspectives, several theodicies have biblical support and provide insights into the evil problem. Suffering according to the punishment or theodicy is that God's just punishment for evildoers. Suffering according to the soul building theodicy sort of transforms people's personalities, shifting their focus from themselves to others. A theodicy known as pain as God's loud hailer says that suffering draws non-believers' attention to God and the afterlife, and where they may have a conversion of heart. Okay, and those who subscribe to a greater good theodicy, they believe that evil exists, but it is ultimately justified because it leads to greater good. This overarching sort of theodicy emphasizes how virtue like bravery, compassion, and forgiveness emerge in the response to adversity. Concerning the message of the Bible, well, it's crucial to ask if the Bible backs up the idea that God orchestrates greater good through the presence of suffering. As we wrestle with the problem of evil and the theoretical responses to it, the answer to the question requires some serious exegetical digging into the passages that shed light on God's motivation and intrinsic relationship between human suffering and his greater plans. Well, a deeper comprehension of God, his dealings with humanity, and a complex web of existence are all up for grabs in the ongoing conversation. So in exploring the nature of evil, we're not only confronted with the philosophical mysteries, but also create opportunities for a personal development and a closer relationship with the mysteries of the divine. Now, it's important to have a framework into which you do found from scripture rather than from theories. So we're looking at the activities, and the activities here will be exploring theodicies through scriptural analysis, objectives. Before we did it through an emotional, experiential, now going into scripture. So this activity engages participants to thoughtfully explore theodicies by analyzing biblical passages that provide insights into the problem of evil and the potential solutions. Participants will be deepening their understanding of theodicy's perspective while considering the aligning with biblical teachings. Materials you'll need here is your Bibles, copies of the text, discussions of the problem of evil and the theodicies. So let's we start off with the introduction, 10 minutes spent here, where we will begin with summarizing the text that discuss the problem of evil, theodicies, and the biblical foundations. Then we will explain that this activities will involve analyzing specific biblical passages to see how they relate to theological concepts. Now, in the small groups, there'll be 20 minutes you will spend in analyzing. Divide the participants into smaller groups of 4 to 6 people. Provide each group with a copy of the text, the book, a list of biblical passages. See below that you will find the relevant theodicies in the book. Instruct each group to read and provide sort of passages and discuss how each passage aligns in different theodicies approach punishment, soul binding, God's megaphone, greater good, etc. Then the group presentation, spend about 15 minutes, have each group in the small groups present their findings to the larger group. Ask each group to share insights about how the passage supports or challenges the respective theodicy perspectives. And then open discussions, 20 minutes, lead discussions with the entire group, focusing on how the following. Question 1. How did the passage from the Bible align or challenge the different theodicy perspectives? Did any specific passage resonate with certain theodicies more strongly? How do these biblical passages contribute to our understanding of the problem of evil and its potential solutions? So make sure that you do some homework and read through it. Not necessarily looking solely to the book. Well, then we're going to close with a personal reflection, about 10 minutes. Ask participants to individually reflect on the specific biblical passages that resonate with them and how it deepens their understanding of theodicies. Well, then you can wrap it up if you like for 10 minutes, summarize the key insights gained from the group discussions and reflections. Emphasize the importance of exploring biblical foundations for theodicy concepts. Well, now here are the key passages that you should consider. Punishment, theodicy, which would be Exodus 34, chapter 34 to verses 6 and 7, Psalms 107 verse 17 to 20, Romans chapter 6 verse 23. Soul binding theodicy, we're looking at James chapter 1 verses 1 to verses 2 to 4, Romans chapter 5 verses 3 to 5, and 1 Peter chapter 4 verses 12 to 13. The pain as God's megaphone theodicy, we're looking at Psalms 119 verse 67, Psalms 119 verse 71, Romans chapter 8 verse 18, greater good theodicy, Romans chapter 8 verse 28, Genesis chapter 50 verse 20, 2 Corinthians chapter 4 verse 17. Well, by examining the pertinent biblical passages, the activities invite participants to consider theodicy arguments, and learners will see how the teachings of the Bible are consistent with the theodicies and how they interpret these verses in light to the problem of evil with greater nuance and sophistication. So in this way, to get even kids thinking critically about evil and suffering, God's purpose, while also helping them to develop a deeper appreciation for the biblical foundations upon which we can rest our faith on. Let's now look into the historical background. Well, the origins of theodicy can be traced back to mankind's age-old attempt to square the circle between faith in the good and all-powerful God and the reality of evil, suffering, and injustice. Well, the philosophical and theological concept of theodicy has evolved and developed over the course of many centuries, reflecting the diverse perspectives of different cultures and intellectual traditions. Philosophical theodicy has a long storied history that tends and extends back to the ancient times. Epicurus, 341 to 270 BC, and other sort of Greek philosophers questioned how good and evil could both exist alongside God's attributes. However, it was early Christian theologians who laid the groundwork for the formal development of theodicy as a systematic response to the issue. Well, the writings of early Christian theologians such as Augustine of Hippo, which is 354 to 430 AD, responsible for the development of theodicy in the Christian thought. Now, in his discussion of original sin and the problem of evil, Augustine argued that evil resulted from the misuse of human free will. In his book, City of God, initiated many theodicies debates that followed. So theodicy was developed by philosophers and theologians during the Middle Ages within the framework of Christianity. The inherent goodness of God's creation was emphasized by thinkers like Thomas Aquinas in 1225 and 1274, who examined evil as a privation of goodness. Now, the best of all possible world theodicy was developed by early modern philosophers like Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1716. Leibniz argued that this world, despite its evil, is the best possible creation because it finds a happy medium between God's perfection and human experience of pain. So during the Enlightenment, philosophers like David Hume in 1711 to 1776 questioned the theodicy of how an all-good God could exist alongside the existence of evil. And the problem of evil and the need for a more robust theodicy were discussed as a result of David Hume's skepticism and criticism. Theodicy continued to develop and diversity throughout the modern and contemporary eras, like philosophers like Alvin Plantinga introduced the free will controversy, arguing that God permits evil because of the significance of free will. Well, John Hick and the other thinkers proposed the soul-making theodicy, which argued that suffering is necessity for a person's sort of spiritual growth. Well, the development of theodicy was shaped by a wide range of cultural and religious perspectives. Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism are just some of the traditions that have different theodicies on the problem of evil, because they each take a slightly different approach to the problem. Well, recent debates, theodicy remains a hotly contested topic in philosophical and theological circles. New perspectives on the issue of evil are investigated by scholars and thinkers from a wide range of disciplines who draw on the recent developments in science and technology, ethical concerns, and the shifting philosophical frameworks. So the development of the theodicy over time, it demonstrates how people of faith have grappled with the problem of evil and suffering throughout history. And the variety of theodicies is indicative of the difficulty of the problem and the thoughtfulness in which it has been approached. Now, there are activities that we're going to be going through, which would be in the book. So do have a look through. At the heart of this is the question is, who is this God? Well, addressing the question of suffering and evil requires firm foundation in the biblical understanding of God's attributes. This comprehension serves as a defense mechanism against being misguided by false beliefs, and as a basis for theoretical reflection, a thorough understanding of God's true nature protects us from falling into the same traps of misinterpretation and doubt that the serpent set for Eve by distorting her perception of God's attributes. Well, attributes are like love, sovereignty, wisdom, goodness, are all woven together into a form of a picture of God's character in the Bible. Now, this enlightenment can be used as a beacon to the darkest hours of suffering. The Bible reassures us that God's omnipotence does not mean that he causes evil, but that he can redeem even the worst circumstances. So even when our knowledge is limited, his wisdom assures us that he sees the big picture. So a firm understanding of God's attributes provides emotional, sustainable hope in times when theoretical discourses seem insufficient. So it is a sobering reminder that God cares deeply about the anguish of the world, and he stays close to those who are hurting. So despite the existence of evil, his goodness remains unflinching. This realization provides hope, provides comfort, trust, allowing us to face adversities in light of a God who is unchanging, a good God. Now, in the end, knowing God as he is portrayed in Scripture gives us believers the ability to tell truth from lies. Even when confronted with the mysteries of suffering, it fortifies us with the knowledge of who God really is, a guiding light in the midst of darkness, of doubt, of despair, allowing us to face adversity with intellectual clarity and emotional assurance. So light versus darkness is one of the issues that we've got to deal with. That God versus evil, the question is, well, the concept of good and evil as two separate and equal forces locked in eternal conflict is central to dualism, a school of theology. This is an idea split in the universe into two parts, opposing forces, which challenge the traditional monotheistic view of God is absolute sovereign. And because it goes against the fundamental Christian beliefs, dualism is a heresy. is in the Christian context. The heresy of dualism can be explained as follows. The biblical depiction of God's sovereignty in a monotheistic or monotheism is directly challenged by a doctrine of dualism. Now, it implies that there is a force of a dark force as a potent as God himself, and that the force exists. And this central tenet of monotheism is that God is one and only, transcendent over all else, and utterly powerful. Psalms 135 verse 6 states, wherever the Lord pleases, he does, he in heaven, on earth, and in the seas, and all the depths, all the inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth, and none can say, stay in his hand, or say to him, what have you done? So God's goodness is called into question when dualism depicts an eternal struggle between two opposing forces. If there is equally potent evil forces, it means God is not all-powerful and that he cannot wipe out evil altogether. This runs counter to the Bible's portrayal of God as the ultimate source of good and love. So the heresy of dualism can be diminished to the importance of Christ's atoning sacrifice. The idea that Christ's sacrifice on the cross is sufficient to vanquish evil is called into the question if evil is equally potent force. So this perspective undermines the redemptive potential of Christ's atonement. Dualism can cause a person's faith to be misplaced by turning attention away from God towards evil. Now, if it is possible that eternal conflict between the forces of good and evil are overshadowed the importance of acknowledging God as the ultimate source of authority, love, and redemption, the result can be warped view of who God is and how he relates to him. God alone says in Isaiah chapter 46, verse 9 and 10, I am God, there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and the ancient times, things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Dualism can lead to a reduction in the value placed on individual accountability and culpability. If evil is just as potent as good, then maybe our free will does not matter at all, much in the grand scheme of things. This runs counter to the teachings of the Bible, which stress the importance of personal accountability, free will, and the result of our actions. By positioning an eternal struggle between two equal potent forces, good and evil, dualism as a theoretical concept challenges the central tenets of Christianity. This runs counter to the monotheistic understanding of God's omnipotence, benevolence, and atoning sacrifice in Christ. The central message of God's love, sovereignty, and salvation is diminished by the heresy of dualism, which distorts the core teachings of Christianity. We must understand that God's sovereignty is not some theoretical concept. Rather, it reveals itself as evidence of his intentionality. Because of this, God is not portrayed as a passive bystander, but rather than he is an active conductor of his own creation. Instead of nullifying individual agency, his omnipotent rule resonates beautifully with the decisions we make and incorporates them into his grand scheme. So God's sovereignty beats with meaning across the entire spectrum of creation and in every human heart. It reaches its pinnacle in the redemptive story, a symphony in which God turns the tumult of human history into a beautiful melody that displays his benevolence and wisdom. So we will be delving and looking into the many facets of God's absolute rule in the forthcoming investigation, its salvation significance, its complex historical function, and its profound personal implications will be revealed. We will grow in the knowledge and the confidence in God, who rules supremely over all, as we explore the terrain of his absolute dominion. So embracing God's sovereignty Few doctrines in all of Christian theology are as foundational as the concept of God's absolute sovereignty. This realization is essential to the very foundation of our faith. It is more than philosophical attraction, so let us study into the firm defense of why it is so important to understand God's sovereignty. We must understand that God's sovereignty is not some theoretical concept. Rather, it reveals itself as evidence of His intentionality. Because of this, God is not portrayed as a passive bystander, but rather He is an active conductor of His own creation. Instead of nullifying individual agency, His omnipotent rule resonates beautifully with the decisions we make and incorporates them into His grand scheme. So God's sovereignty beats with meaning across the entire spectrum of creation and in every human heart. It reaches its pinnacle in the redemptive story, a symphony in which God turns the tumult of human history into a beautiful melody that displays His benevolence and wisdom. So we will be delving and looking into the many facets of God's absolute rule in the forthcoming investigation. Its salvation significance, its complex historical function, and its profound personal implications will be revealed. We will grow in the knowledge and the confidence in God, who rules supremely over all, as we explore the terrain of His absolute dominion. So, embracing God's sovereignty, few doctrines in all of Christian theology are as foundational as the concept of God's absolute sovereignty. This realization is essential to the very foundation of our faith. It is more than philosophical attraction, so let us study into the firm defense of why it is so important to understand God's sovereignty. The Christian faith, a holistic view. While Christians have always sought to understand His plan for humanity, as the outlines of God's power and authority are revealed, it has become crucial to embrace God's sovereignty. How can a good God allow suffering, is the question. And other such questions reverberate in our hearts. And this whole study attempts to answer that. Well, how does His providence coexist with our free will? And we can make sense of God's big picture by viewing it through the lens of the absolute sovereignty of God, which includes His love, justice, and mercy, and is the foundation upon which Christianity and its theology is built. So, dealing with uncertainty and adversity, the path we take through life is fraught with obstacles and peril. Knowing that God is ultimately in control is like having a lighthouse during these stormy times. It is a rock-solid reminder that God is not just a bystander to our lives, but rather a conductor. So knowing that even in the darkest valleys, His providence prevails, brings comfort to those who acknowledge His sovereignty in the face of chaos and adversity. This contemplation of God's omnipotence inspires awe, reverence, and humility. And as a result, we are forced to acknowledge our smallness in face of the infinite wisdom and love of the universe creator. So when we realize that God's ways are beyond our comprehension, we are humbled and are able to worship more fully. So recognizing His absolute helps us appreciate the grace, giving us control, and increases our faith in His direction and providence. So revealing to the core ideas. So by accepting the doctrine of God's sovereignty, we are able to get to the core ideas that form the basis of our theology. It reveals God's omnipotence over the universe, His dynamic role in humanity history, His personal involvement in each of our individual destinies. This realization compels us to look into the far-reaching implications it has, how the sovereignty contacts us and interacts with us, His love, and how He plans to play out the fabric of human existence, and how our faith intertwines into His purpose. So this doctrine of God's sovereignty is like a beautiful symphony, a melody. It is perfectly, it reveals, it makes up the grand symphony of our faith. Its significance goes beyond simple intellectual understanding. It becomes a safety net in times of trouble, a reason for awe, and a call to explore God's nature in greater detail. So we accept His teachings. We find resolution to our theological questions, but also a permanent link to the very center of God. So God's sovereignty and the problem of evil. So exploring the biblical evidences for God's sovereignty shed light on the knotty connections between this doctrines and mystery of evil. So we dig deeper into the Bible and we find insights of how God's sovereignty relates to the problem of evil. The account in Genesis chapter 1 provides an early glimpse into God's sovereignty as creator. The fact that He can create everything simply by speaking it into existence is a demonstration of His absolute power and authority. This chapter that we are going through in life not just deals with the issue of evil head on, but does lay some groundwork in establishing that God's authority as creator and His supremacy over everything, that even at the end of this portion of our life, He brings to completion. God's omnipotence is on full display throughout Old Testament. His ability to control time and nature to achieve His ends is demonstrated by the full accounts of the flood and Exodus. The complexity of the problem of evil is made clearer when we consider God's sovereignty permits both existence of evil and His divine intervention and in the midst of it. So the problem of evil and suffering raises the question of how God's sovereignty over the universe interacts with these realities. God's handiwork is on display in both Joseph's rise from slavery and leadership and Cyrus the Great's role in restoring Israel. The issue of evil is given a divine perspective in the context. And the essence of this connection is summarized in Romans chapter 8, verse 28. God's sovereignty does not do away with suffering, but rather incorporates it into a larger divine plan that ultimately benefits those who love Him. So God's omnipotence and existence of evil present in tension worthy of thought and existence of evil does not invalidate God's sovereignty. Rather, it demonstrates the extent to which He rules the universe. The Bible's teaching on God's sovereignty gives us comfort in the face of incomprehensibility of evil's origin and persistence. So when troubling, and the problem of evil is not isolated from the story of God's redemptive plan, which includes restoration and the ultimate victory of good over evil. The Christian faith, a holistic view. While Christians have always sought to understand His plan for humanity, as the outlines of God's power and authority are revealed, it has become crucial to embrace God's sovereignty. How can a good God allow suffering, is the question. And other such questions reverberate in our hearts. And this whole study attempts to answer that. Well, how does His providence coexist with our free will? And we can make sense of God's big picture by viewing it through the lens of the absolute sovereignty of God, which includes His love, justice, and mercy, and is the foundation upon which Christianity and its theology is built. So dealing with uncertainty and adversity, the path we take through life is fraught with obstacles and peril. Knowing that God is ultimately in control is like having a lighthouse during these stormy times. It is a rock-solid reminder that God is not just a bystander to our lives, but rather a conductor. So knowing that even in the darkest valleys, His providence prevails, brings comfort to those who acknowledge His sovereignty in the face of chaos and adversity. This contemplation of God's omnipotence inspires awe, reverence, and humility. And as a result, we are forced to acknowledge our smallness in face of the infinite wisdom and love of the universe creator. So when we realize that God's ways are beyond our comprehension, we are humbled and are able to worship more fully. So recognizing his absolute helps us appreciate the grace, giving us control, and increases our faith in his direction and providence. So revealing to the core ideas. So by accepting the doctrine of God's sovereignty, we are able to get to the core ideas that form the basis of our theology. It reveals God's omnipotence over the universe, his dynamic role in humanity history, his personal involvement in each of our individual destinies. So this doctrine of God's sovereignty is like a beautiful symphony, a melody. It is perfectly, it reveals, it makes up the grand symphony of our faith. Its significance goes beyond simple intellectual understanding. It becomes a safety net in times of trouble, a reason for awe, and a call to explore God's nature in greater detail. So we accept his teachings. We find resolution to our theological questions, but also a permanent link to the very center of God. So God's sovereignty and the problem of evil. So exploring the biblical evidences for God's sovereignty sheds light on the knotty connections between this doctrines and mystery of evil. So we dig deeper into the Bible and we find insights of how God's sovereignty relates to the problem of evil. The account in Genesis chapter 1 provides an early glimpse into God's sovereignty as creator. The fact that he can create everything simply by speaking it into existence is a demonstration of his absolute power and authority. This chapter that we are going through in life not just deals with the issue of evil head on, but does lay some groundwork in establishing that God's authority as creator and his supremacy over everything, that even at the end of this portion of our life, he brings to completion. God's omnipotence is on full display throughout Old Testament. His ability to control time and nature to achieve his ends is demonstrated by the full accounts of the flood and Exodus. The complexity of the problem of evil is made clearer when we consider God's sovereignty permits both existence of evil and his divine intervention and in the midst of it. So the problem of evil and suffering raises the question of how God's sovereignty over the universe interacts with these realities. So God's divine plan and providence. God's sovereign plan, which involves human history and individual lives, is gradually revealed throughout the biblical narrative. God's handiwork is on display in both Joseph's rise from slavery and leadership and Cyrus the Great's role in restoring Israel. The issue of evil is given a divine perspective in the context, and the essence of this connection is summarized in Romans chapter 8 verse 28. God's sovereignty does not do away with suffering, but rather incorporates it into a larger divine plan that ultimately benefits those who love him. So God's omnipotence and existence of evil present intention worthy of thought and existence of evil does not invalidate God's sovereignty. Rather, it demonstrates the extent to which he rules the universe. The Bible's teaching on God's sovereignty gives us comfort in the face of incomprehensibility of evil's origin and persistence. So when troubling, and the problem of evil is not isolated from the story of God's redemptive plan, which includes restoration and the ultimate victory of good over evil.